Welcome back to the next webinar organized by Princeton University's Bentham Center for Finance. We were happy to have Danny Roderick with us from the Harvard Kennedy School. Hi, Danny. So today we will talk about the future of globalization after the COVID crisis. How will the COVID crisis change things? And I would like to give some introductory remarks first. And as usual, let me go back what we have seen so far and what we will go on further on. Last Friday, Michael Kramer was talking about vaccine development, and it was a very interesting talk, why we should develop 15 vaccines simultaneously and how we should streamline and incentivize the process of vaccine development as a cooperation between governments and private firms. Then I would also like to come back to Penny Goldberg's presentation on global value chains, which is connected to today's globalization debate, and perhaps we come back to this as well. And would like to mention that Daron Acemoglu
can I just interrupt for 1 second
on the benefits of
we
targeted policies.
We actually don't see you. Is there a way you can turn your video on?
I think if I do that, I probably lose the slides.
Okay.
I think for you it will work, but something is different today. Zoom changed the setting. Thanks. So let me just do without, nobody can see me today, but you can hear me hopefully. And so on Friday, Daron Acemoglu will talk. And then next week we have Jeremy Stein talking about the Fed policies. And then on Friday, Paul Krugman. So let me talk to today's about globalization. I want to go and start with a bigger picture. And then Danny will actually, will talk the much bigger picture. But let me first talk about the world order. The two ways you can see the world order we live in. You can have a rule-based, institution-based world order, or a more outcome-based world order. The latter has the advantage that it is more flexibility. A large country can just push through its own interest more flexibly and react to circumstances. But the former, the rule-based world order, has much more predictability, especially in a world where things become more and more complex. The rule-based order also has some limited reactions to shocks. So you can only react to a particular way. You can't just react in any way you would like to react. And is therefore a little bit more symmetric. So the outcome-based is less symmetric because a large country can push through certain interests on its own. Then the third difference is that, in a rule-based order, if there's an adverse feedback loop or a negative feedback loop, there might be trade wars or currency wars. The rules prevent such feedback loops. And this gives the whole system, if it's based on rules, a more stability, while an outcome-based world order is less stable because nobody controls these feedback loops. Now, what are the institutions and the rules? The global institutions, you have the United Nations, WTO, IMF, World Bank, WHO, and so forth. And of course, you have a lot of regional blocs as well. Now, the world order, if it's rule-based, you might say it might be a disadvantage for large countries, but it's not necessarily the case, because the large countries can actually better push through certain rules. They can shape the rules, and they can also control the internal politics. So there might be some forces to push for national champions and other things, which might, some favoritism at home. So having international rules might also discipline the behavior at home. So that's an advantage. But the big advantage is, of course, for large countries, they have more influence to shape the global rules. And that's also why we see more and more blocks developing. So countries form blocks together in order to have more influence and to shape the rules. Now, in terms of economics, what are the challenges of the economic order? So there are two challenges, of course. So what are the rules necessary to ensure the functioning of the system? And what can you do such that the rules still reflect some national preferences and identity? So there's recent work by Grossman and Helpman focusing very much on identity issues. So that's still, and I think Danny will talk at length about this too. So different areas of the economic orders is intellectual property rights, patents, competition, health, GMOs, quarantine chicken comes to mind, and environmental and social standards, and of course also privacy rules. And the other big challenge is how to enforce all of these rules and who is enforcing it and is it credibly enforced. Now, in terms of geopolitics and economics, there's of course a balance of power, and Larry Summers coined the famous phrase, balance of financial terror. Essentially, China is holding a lot of US treasuries and has therefore also some control over the influence of the US and vice versa. So there's a balance of power in this case. So if you have financial integration and if you have economic integration, you create some interdependency. You lose some autonomy, but you have some interdependency. You see this very clearly when Penny Goldberg was talking about global value chains. It's very, very important that there's some interdependence there. So the forces interact, of course, and there's also a convergence to common values. There's a pressure to create common human values that there will be, reflected in this setting. And there will be a flows of ideas and of people, and that makes wars more costly. Once you have global value chains, it's much more difficult, much more costly to go start a conflict. And you have also, of course, common threats, like the current COVID crisis. Coronavirus is a common threat. And this might be also sharpen your mind to stick together, but it might also be a divisive force. But you lose, of course, diversity. You lose, to some extent, the possibility to have regional experimentation, and you might lose some identity as well. That's, Grossman and Helpman worked on identity, as I mentioned before, and your resiliency might depend very much whether you have a regional shock, and then actually heavy integration helps because only one region might have a shock and the other region can help out. But if you have a symmetric global shock as we have now, the resiliency might be compromised. You might feel too safe in this. Let me move on a little bit about the geopolitics and globalization and refer to some work I did with Raj Doshi and Harold James, where we looked at this, how great powers compete economically these days. And what we did actually, we compared Germany, Imperial Germany, with the UK, the rivalry which happened in the late 19th century, with the rivalry which happens now between China and the United States. And how do these great powers compete economically? And you can see that they're competing in a sense. There's one way to compete is with global infrastructure projects. So you have power projection through the infrastructure projects. And everybody's familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is here the right picture. But, it's very similar to the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And if you go to Istanbul, you see still the train station of the big railway, which was planned to run from Berlin all the way to Baghdad. So the analogies are just striking between what happened in the late 19th century Germany and what China is doing now. You can also have a lot of what we call fighting with finance. So you have, interaction, you use your financial industry to fund some projects or gain influence abroad. And most importantly, what I would like to focus on a little bit there now is this technological standard setting. So you have essentially the ability to set the standards. If you look at when Europe was able to set the standards on the mobile phone standards on GSM, it got a competitive advantage. China tries to set the standard on the 5G network. And of course, the technological standard setting, I think, is way more important these days than looking at tariffs or other elements. And that's what we outlined there. I would like to spend 2 more slides on the technology side and go from there. The question is a little bit, do we want a flow of ideas? What's the optimal degree of openness of flow of ideas? On the one hand, if you have too open flow of ideas, you don't allow regional experimentation anymore. It's more complicated to try your own way, and you might limit natural monopolies as well. So, and that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you allow a lot of flow of ideas, you allow cross-pollination. So that's actually, somebody develops an idea in one region, and you can also use it in the other region. And that's actually a good thing. In general, the size and speed matters. Having a large home market matters to a large degree. If you have a large home market, you can set the standards, especially for technology, and that gives you an edge. So smaller countries probably will associate themselves with larger countries in order to be part of a larger block in order to set the standards, which then impact new technological development and then gives you an edge in this new technology. Very important is also the privacy considerations. If you think about the 5G network, there's a big debate on these issues, and that's very important when we talk about globalization as well. Now, what's about borders and blocks? I would like to make the case that we have legal borders, we have countries and blocks of countries putting together, but technology or data largely ignores national borders and creates their own borders in form of networks. What's the border of Facebook? There's no border. It has its own network. And that technology in general raises difficult issues in terms of globalization, on competition side, on privacy or preferences more generally side. And you can actually use networks, what's often referred to as weaponization of networks through surveillance, dependency, as you can use also currency, the weaponization of the dollar, as many people have talked about. So I would like to finish my introductory remarks with a short poll question. Should we use the COVID crisis to rethink all of the globalization we went through in the last few decades and also trade? Or should we go back to the status pre-crisis? So we go back what we did before, but is this a nice opportune possibility to really rethink the whole globalization, how the whole world order should look like? And I would like to get your opinion on that. And the second question is, will a granular approach motivated by health considerations ultimately kill trade like it did in the 1930s? So should we allow for that, or will it, it's a prediction question, will it kill it or not? Yes or no? So A is yes and B is no. And the third aspect is, will the implications for the emerging and developing economies, countries, will it be detrimental? As we have seen in the last few decades, of course, China and other countries benefited enormously from technological transfer, as Penny Goldberg pointed out. And that's very bad. Should we, be sad about this, or is it okay? So is it very bad, or is it okay in order to eliminate inequalities within the advanced economies? And so I want to leave it with that and ask questions, and perhaps we can answer these questions briefly, and then we can I can just summarize them. Can you see the results? So the questions were, should we use COVID crisis to rethink globalization and trade more generally? 86% think we should fundamentally rethink it, and only 14% think we should go back what we had before. Okay, that's a very strong statement, I think, and that we have to then fundamentally rethink, and Danny will help us to start this thinking, or he started it a long time ago. Second question is, will this granular approach, we will drift because of these health considerations, we will kill trade ultimately, and only 22% think that's the case, and 78% think no, that's not the case. Trade will be an important component in any new world order. And finally, the third question is, will the implications for the emerging economies, will it be detrimental because technological transfer will decline, or will it be okay? And 62% think it will be detrimental, and only 38% think it will be okay. So with this, let me pass the floor to Danny, and he will give us his perspective. Thanks a lot, Danny. Can you share your screen?
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus, very much for this. You've really put together a fantastic lineup of speakers, and you're to be congratulated for that. I also love the way that you begin each one of these with a mini lecture of your own, which is always interesting. I should tell you that my great-grandfather worked for the Berlin-Baghdad airway back in the Ottoman times.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I do have a personal connection to some of the earlier geopolitical competitions that you discussed. I'm going to be talking about where we're headed with globalization, and talk about my own ideas about where we could be or should be going. First, with respect to the immediate impact of COVID-19, everybody who's listening into this knows that the immediate impact on economic globalization has been very negative. We can see that in a very large reduction, or in this case, very large outflow of portfolio flows from the emerging markets in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Much bigger outflow than we've ever seen. We also see it in current projections on what's likely to happen to the volume of world trade. The WTO projects that the volume of trade this year will decline from somewhere between 10 and 35%. And that's, again, a very, very large reversal. But as this chart actually shows, there was already a process of what we might call deglobalization that was going on well before the current pandemic, the current crisis, or in fact well before Trump launched his trade war against China. This chart from the WTO shows the trend in the growth of trade pre-2008 and since 2008, and you can see very clearly in this chart that the trend growth rate already was significantly slower. So the first point that I really want to make is that even though the effect of the pandemic on globalization is certainly negative, I think this effect works mainly in the direction of reinforcing and retrenching and entrenching some trends that were already in place and that we can already see in the statistics. So again, returning to world trade, since the financial crisis of 2008-2009, there has been a significant decline in the buoyancy of world trade. So this, if you look at the these individual little diamonds here, they are sort of the annual elasticities of world trade with respect to GDP. And typically in the post-war period, these elasticities have always been significantly above 1, meaning that when world GDP grew by 1%, world trade, the volume of world trade grew by 1.5%, 1.6%. But these elasticities have significantly come down, have hovered around 1, and in fact have fallen below 1 very, very recently. We have to remember that one of the biggest driver of the post-1990 expansion of world trade was, of course, China, with its major expansion of exports and correspondingly imports. There has been really a dramatic reduction in the export orientation of the Chinese economy. This shows that the China's export to GDP ratio is fallen from somewhere around 36% to something like 20%. So that's like a 16 percentage point decline in the export to GDP ratio of China, which reflects a number of different things, including China bringing back supply chains back home. But this major driver of trade globalization is significantly slowed down. More specifically, global value chains have also, the growth of global value chains have begun to slow down as well. Perhaps the bit of this that surprised me the most when I was looking at the data is that even growth in service exports has been significantly slowing down, because services was the part of exports that have been expanding the most rapidly in recent years. But just last year, the growth of service exports was very, very anemic. And with respect to financial globalization, I think I have not actually seen data like this for the last couple of years, but the volume of cross-border capitals have actually also declined since the pre-financial crisis peak. Now, much of this is actually what's happening within the euro area, but still, we're below the pre-financial crisis peak. So all of these are suggesting that there is an ongoing process, whether you look at trade as a whole, global value chains, you look at finance, that there's an ongoing process of, rather than calling it deglobalization, I guess I would rather call it a process of a retreat from hyperglobalization. Is the term that I'll try to say a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So if we take it as a given that the COVID-19 crisis is simply going to reinforce and is not going to be necessarily bad if we manage in the process to construct a more sensible globalization, one that's based on economically more sound principles than the one that we have had. This is by no means a foregone conclusion. We could easily end up going off the rails in a major way. And so we don't know exactly. So what I'm going to be arguing for certainly is not a prognosis. If I were to make a prognosis, I would probably say that we're more likely to go wrong, at least in the short to medium term, than go right. But I want to suggest that there is a path forward that does not entail trying to reestablish the hyper-globalist order that we've tried to build since the 1990s. That retreats in some ways, or I should say not retreats in some ways from that, but also rebuilds globalization on a more sustainable, more inclusive manner. So in the rest of my talk, what I want to do is just try to diagnose a little bit what went wrong with our hyper-globalist model that is now in retreat. I want to step back and say, okay, if we were to construct a sensible economic globalization, what kind of normative principles would we want to apply? So that's normative logic of global regimes. And that's going to lead me into discussion of what kind of globalization we should want. And then to the extent that there is time left, I want to apply those principles to what is probably the most important economic relationship of our day in terms of playing a role in determining the future of economic globalization. That's the U.S.-China economic relationship. And I want to say a little bit about how these broad normative principles can be rendered concrete and be applied to the U.S.-China relationship. So that's sort of the plan. I titled this slide "Making a Globalization" because I want to drive home the point that globalization is not something that, because of technology, because of information and communication revolution, that it's something that's totally exogenous, that just falls onto our laps, that we've had no control over. I think far from it. I think the particular type of economic globalization we've had since the 1990s is one that has been the result of conscious decisions, policy decisions that have been made by important actors, governments, and of course banks and firms making and pushing the government's policy decisions in particular directions. So we need to understand that globalization is not a kind of necessarily a self-generated regime. That a globalization runs on both rules, explicit rules, as well as on norms. So the policy decisions we make here are key. Some of these rules are explicit and they're written into legislation or agreements. So we have a bunch of trade and investment agreements, everything from the WTO, the rules of the WTO, to bilateral or multilateral or regional trade and investment agreements. We have the extremely important set of banking laws and regulations within financial centers, New York City and London, that sustain financial globalization. OECD membership requires rules that are sort of imposed or that countries have to adopt in order to join and remain members of the OECD. Of course, the European Union runs on now, I think it's nearly 200,000 pages of rules and regulations called the Acquis Communautaire. All of that sort of sustains a common single market in Europe. So some of these are explicit, but I think others, and often much more important, are the rules that underpin globalization that are internalized through norms of good behavior. So, for example, for the vast majority of emerging markets and developing countries today, the norm of openness to capital flows is not necessarily one that is enforced through international agreements. It's not something that the IMF or any investment agreement makes those countries do. It's a norm that these policymakers in those countries themselves have internalized. Similarly, I think many decisions that developed country policymakers make with respect to whether to prioritize the international trade investment regime or to prioritize domestic economic and social policy goals, those priorities are the result of certain norms about what good policy making entails and are not things that are simply enforced on Europe or the United States by the WTO. So therefore, the question then becomes, where do these rules come from? Who writes those rules? Whose preferences, whose policy preferences are privileged? And that's the whole point about making a globalization. That globalization regime gets to be determined by these explicit choices that are being made. So to drive the point home, sometimes I make the following, which is, I think, it's comparison or thought experiment that is perhaps particularly germane today in the midst of a health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, is to imagine that we had invested all our political capital and international diplomacy on building a kind of globalization that revolved around global public health, and that had elevated the World Health Organization to a kind of organization that is as central to globalization as, let's say, the IMF, the OECD, or the WTO is today when we think about globalization. Alternatively, think about a globalization that revolves around a set of rules on